Alright, this is our video on freshwater pollution, and today we're going to talk about how adding any substance to the water can negatively affect not only the quality of the water but the living things in the water. Potable we've already defined as the amount of water that's available and clean enough and safe enough to be considered drinking water. So if you have, a river has high potability, or a stream or a lake, that is very good. If it has low potability, that means there are a lot of things that have been added to the water to impact the water quality. The quality is not good, it is negative. Water pollution includes our treated wastewater that goes back into our lakes and rivers, any runoff from the land, toxic chemicals that have been buried or dumped, municipal sewage, so our sewage, if we have any leaking sewage pipes, if that gets back into the water, cars leak motor oil and exhaust, fertilizers, detergents, pesticides, anything that can be washed into our bodies of water is considered a water pollutant. So, some waste is not liquid waste, but it can have solid waste in it, and they're going to settle to the bottom. Over time, more rainwater, more water being added in will dilute the water, and the water cycle and the wetlands are natural ways that nature has figured out how to clean water. Unfortunately, the amount that we are putting in compared to how nature can filter it is not as effective anymore, and that's why we have water pollution. Nutrient waste is any waste that's high in nitrates and phosphates and acts like as a fertilizer for all of the plant matter in our bodies of water. So for example, if algae begins to grow out of control and the water gets a green cast to it, or this scum growing on it, the algae population is too large, and that's called nutrient pollution. And eutrophication can occur, and when you get too much algae in the water, it acts like a trap and doesn't allow more oxygen to come in from the atmosphere, and so it literally chokes the fish. So dissolved oxygen is one of the most important measures of water quality. If there's not enough dissolved oxygen in the body of water for fish to survive, then it is very polluted, and we'll say it has undergone the process of eutrophication. So in this diagram, you can see that fresh oxygen has to come into the water through the atmosphere. And if this layer of plant matter covers the surface of the body, then new oxygen can't come in, and eventually the organisms that live under the surface are not going to have enough oxygen to breathe. We also have sediment pollution, which is the #1 cause of water pollution in our state. And what would you say causes sediment runoff? And we'll pause here for a second. How would sediments harm water quality? Let's pause here and answer this question. So, the #1 reason we've had sediment pollution in North Carolina is because we have had rapid growth since the early 80s. And with that, we've had what's the process of called clear cutting. When you go in to build apartment buildings or neighborhoods or office buildings or shopping centers, all the trees are cut down, all the covering on the soil is scraped away, and in the process of building, which can take 6 months, 9 months, or over a year, you have rain, and our clay soil causes everything to run off and go into the rivers. So there's nothing to hold the soil in place, and when all this soil and sediment gets dumped in the river, it makes the water very cloudy, so sunlight doesn't penetrate, so it limits the natural process of photosynthesis for the plant matter, which is the base of the food chain in the river and streams. It also buries the organisms that live on the bottom of the river. And if those bottom dwellers get buried, or their eggs get buried, or their babies get buried, it's going to affect the overall health of the population and the food chain in that body of water. Effluent is what you call any waste material that gets discharged in the environment. So you might hear air pollution, water pollution, land pollution. Anything that gets dumped is called effluent. There are two general categories of pollutants, and that is point source pollution and non-point source. If it is point source, it is pointing at you. You can find out who was to blame. When we did the Fruitvale lab series, we said that in point source pollution and Fruitvale, the Eden Agriculture Company that produced the no-bug pesticide, could we point our fingers and say they dumped the no-bug, or did the farmer that owned the Eat-em-up Berry Farm or the Orchard Farm dump it? We don't know. So that would not be point source. We know who produced it, but we don't know who buried it right above wells 7 and 8. So that would be non-point source pollution. And unfortunately, most of our pollutants that go into our bodies of water are non-point source. We can't figure out who the actual guilty party is that put them in the water. Every time it rains and all of the motor oil and leaking gasoline and anything else that's on our roadways gets washed down into the sewer system and ends up back into the creeks and rivers, we don't know which car was leaking that gasoline. That is non-point source pollution. If you can trace it back, for example, if a farmer has a hog lagoon for hog poop on his farm, and there is heavy rain and that lagoon floods and all that waste runs down into the river, you can see where it has flooded and breached over the surface of the lagoon and gone into the river. Then you could point your finger at that farmer and blame him. Unfortunately, most of our fertilizers, our pesticides, all those things that go in, everybody is guilty of using them, and then when it rains and runs off, it ends up in our river systems. Now, one of the things we don't calculate when we think about water pollution is this idea of biomagnification and accumulation. We were talking about PCBs. We talked about how we don't digest them and excrete them, and they just build up in the tissue. And so as you go up the food chain, organisms that have these chemicals stored in their tissue, the bigger the organism, the more food they eat, so the more opportunities to collect these chemicals in their tissue. So the first level consumer or producer absorbs the chemical first. It gets into its leaves, its plant matter. Then the first level consumer eats it, and they eat again and again and again, and they absorb more of the chemical. And then the second level consumer eats the first level consumer. Again, they're going to eat more food, so they're going to consume more, and on up the food chain. So when you get to the top of the food chain, which would be usually the mammal, it would be the bald eagle, it would be the human eating the large fish, then that's when the health problems increase. In the case of the bald eagle and the pesticide DDT, the reproductive organs of the female were affected. In the case of PCBs, it's a cancer-causing agent. So depending on what the chemical is, what would the results be? In the case of mercury, it affects the brain, and you have neurological disorders. So it's magnified at the top level consumer. So here is the image from the use of DDT. So at the bottom you can see, look how small that is in parts per million. And then you get up to the bald eagle or the osprey at the top, who eat much larger fish and eat more often, and so the chemical gets built up. And look at, they're in 25 parts per million, and they're built up in their tissues, so they're more likely to have health problems as a result. and then we'll finish this tomorrow.